Doula Chronicles Reproductive Futurism is a virtual gathering in honor of the work of Lorretta and Octavia Butler have done for us, and we will be following in their footsteps on dreaming and creating what a better future around pregnancy and birth can look like. As birth workers, we are on the front lines of the maternal health crisis. We witness near misses, mistreatment from healthcare staff, and obstetric violence. Grieving and mourning is a part of our work, and so is creating anew where it didn't exist before. This virtual gathering will be a space to share with your comrades what the future can look like. As said by one of our elders and our favorite not grand midwife yet, but eventually midwives, Jenny Joseph, we are in the business of saving lives. I'm joined here today with Lindsey. Sorry. It's my phone just like cut off. Lindsey Vestal, did I say that correctly?
That's right.
Is the founder of the Functional Pelvis, the first in-home pelvic health practice in New York City run by an occupational therapist. She has helped thousands of people overcome chronic pelvic health challenges like incontinence and pelvic pain. Her goal is to empower women and men to listen to the wisdom of their own bodies without resorting to invasive surgeries and prescription drugs so that they can heal and get back to enjoy life again. She takes a different approach from other pelvic health experts. In fact, she doesn't really take an expert approach at all. Instead, she relies on her clients to share their expertise about their own bodies. That way, she can offer the personalized support they need to regain control of their basic bodily functions. She considers the whole person, not just the outward physical symptoms. She doesn't believe kegels are a one-stop shop for every pelvic floor dysfunction. Lindsey, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Oh, before we get started, I want to remind folks to put your comments and your interactions with Lindsey and each other in the chat section and leave the questions in the Q&A box. We will leave the last portion of the session, around 15 minutes or so, to answer those questions. So try to let them simmer if they may be answered during the presentation as well.
That sounds great. That sounds great. I'm so incredibly happy that you all are here. How I wish, of course, we were all in one big room together, but I'm going to take this virtual energy from every single one of you and hope that I can serve you, because throughout my years of being a pelvic floor therapist, it has meant so much to me to be able to share, experience, and learn from each one of you about the pelvic floor, and not only how we can serve and hold space for our clients, but how, and the focus of this presentation today is going to be about how we can do that for ourselves. So there's so much that we learn for our clients that we can apply to ourselves. And I think it's this really beautiful relationship that can go back and forth with one another. The more we know about ourselves, the more we can help our clients, and vice versa. So the presentation that I'll be sharing with you, hold on just one moment as I share my screen, is aptly titled, Take Control of Your Own Pelvic Floor First. And that resonates with me and means a lot to me, because I don't know if you guys heard in that beautiful introduction that Effie shared with us, is I'm an occupational therapist. And there's a brief story that if you don't mind, you can indulge me as I share this with you, is I had my fair share of physical therapy experiences throughout my life where, I went and I felt like someone was fixing me and there was something broken about me that they could help me with, right? And as I was doing my own investigative research to become a pelvic floor therapist, which was something the geeky side of me always knew I wanted to be, was like, isn't there a way that we could really acknowledge the person, as a detective of their own body, where we were simply their guide? We weren't fixing anything. We were their guide, and we held space for them to discover those aspects of themselves that perhaps just needed a bit of a flashlight, that we could help them shine on it so they can make those steps themselves. So the focus of our conversation today is really going to be about how we can be our own best detectives for ourselves, and how we can empower our clients to be their own best detectives, because let's face it, no one knows us better than ourselves. And when we take one step forward in learning that, we gain that confidence and that wisdom to just keep learning. So please have your mind, as we talk this afternoon, have your mind with your client in mind, but I really want you to take a moment and think about yourself during this particular talk. You can always revisit it and think about it again with how you can help your clients. So this talk is going to serve dual purpose, but I ask you and urge you to think about yourself for this next 45 minutes together. Okay. So as we talked about, feel free to throw questions in the chat. We will reserve some time at the end for that formal space to get your questions answered. So as I said, we're going to be talking about tools for both your clients and you, okay? And I want to just highlight a phrase that I actually heard earlier this week, which is we're going to be indulging in me-search versus research. So much about the pelvic floor and about the core is about, Googling and finding out the best Kegel exercise to fix our problem. And that to me really emphasizes looking outward and not looking inward. And so this term of me-search versus research really resonated with me, and I think speaks a little bit to not only my approach in general, but our talk this afternoon, because what you're going to hear me do throughout is urge you to look inward and kind of find out what it is you need for those next steps and how you can likewise facilitate that for your clients. Okay, so let's start with defining the core, right? We can't talk about something as, as complicated and as mystical and mythical as the core and pelvic floor without defining it first. Let's all get on the same page, and then we can enrich our conversation from there, right? So when we talk about the core, there are actually 4 parts. Most of us just hear this term, I'm going to be working my core, with doing my crunches, my sit-ups. It's a lot more layered and nuanced and beautiful than that. There's actually 4 parts to this system, and 4 beautiful parts that not only contribute to a whole, but each on their own really deserve a little bit of time and space to explore. So of course it includes the pelvic floor. That, believe it or not, there are 14 to 16 muscles in our pelvic floor, which comprise the basket of our being. It really is that area between our pubic bone, our tailbone, and our 2 sits bones. So it forms this beautiful diamond shape. It holds our organs, but as I like to say, it does so much more than that, even just from a physiological standpoint. So the pelvic floor is at the bottom of our tailbone, right? It's at the bottom of our spine, but it's connected to the spine that goes all the way up to the top of our head, the very tip top of the spine. So that means the pelvic floor's job is to not only support those beautiful organs within the pelvis, but everything above it, right? All of everything that makes us human, everything above, even to the top of our 8 to 10 pound skull. It's a big job. It's a big job. Second part of the core is our low abdomen. So for the anatomy geeks in the room, this is known as the transversus abdominis, or TA. It's those corset muscles, basically right below the belly button. Okay, so that's a big part of the core. Probably the king of the whole system, and my favorite aspect to it all is the diaphragm. So let's just take a moment to feel our own diaphragm. It's sometimes the most ambiguous of the 4 to some of us. And it's the area right sort of at the top of our rib cage, maybe below where a bra line would sit. Okay, so kind of cup your hands like this and put the front of your fingers right at the front, and then the thumbs hook around to the back. And just watch your breath. So breathe at your own tempo. No outwardly guidance here. Just feel your own breath for a moment. This is such an important part of our core. And what's optimal in this system would be the feeling both, okay, Juju says she can't see my hands. I'm just going to adjust myself here. So right here. So you've got the front right underneath my bra line area, and then my thumb in the back of my body. Okay. So that area, you should feel some movement in the front of your fingertips You should feel movement in your thumbs and then in the webbing, right in your fingertips. This means that you're breathing in this beautiful three-dimensional way. So you're not just belly breathing. You're certainly not just chest breathing or neck breathing, which is more of like a stressful fight or flight response. Now, this part of the body is involved in the diaphragm breath, but some people will just breathe there. Or I want you to think about more embodying this lower region, which has such an incredible, we're going to get into this more, but it has such an incredible relationship with the pelvic floor. So this is true diaphragmatic 360 breathing that comprises north, south, east, and west. And then lastly, on the back of our spine, we have an additional fourth part, and this really helps us with posture, and it's just sort of the back companion to all those other beautiful muscles that we talked about. Okay, so I mentioned that we were going to get into how the pelvic floor and diaphragm relate, and here's our first slide into that. So what I want you to notice here is that the diaphragm, that part we just felt in that three-dimensional breathing way, is here. I'm going to put my cursor there. Hopefully you all can see it at the top there. And it's this dome shape. Now, bring your eyes a little bit lower to where the pelvic floor is. Do you notice how they're actually kind of symbiotic relationships of it? They're like parentheses of one another, right? They're mirror images of one another. And what's even more exciting is that they communicate with each other. Every breath we take, which by the way, we take 20,000 breaths a day, right? With every breath we take, the diaphragm and the pelvic floor speak to one another, which right off the bat, when I learned that, I was like, breathing is the foundation. Breathing is the most fundamental thing we can do to enrich and enliven and restore our pelvic floor. Why is that? So much of the pelvic floor is about our nervous system. And when we can breathe well, and we can breathe in this beautiful, harmonious way, it's a little bit like a French press, where the diaphragm goes down and the pelvic floor responds on the inhale. And on the exhale, they rise back up together. When we can breathe that way, our stress and our nervous system really quiets. Right? So not only are we feeding our very innate nervous system, which absolutely impacts the pelvic floor, we're getting these two muscles to work together to increase blood flow, to oxygenate the system, right? Movement at the end of the day is the best thing we can do for any body part. So of course, for the pelvic floor, it is absolutely paramount. We're going to get into that, Juju. I appreciate that comment. Okay, so we're going to do a very quick overview of what happens on the inhale and what happens on the exhale. Before we do that, just take another moment, because I don't want to rush this part. If I'm in a room with people, I can really sense whether or not it's time. So in the virtual space, I found that just leaving a little bit of extra time for self-exploration makes sure that we've got everybody in the same space as one another. So put your hands back around in that same way, right? Where your fingers are in the front, your thumb was in the back. And just take a moment to get a sense of potentially that communication that is happening in the pelvic floor. Okay. Now you may feel absolutely nothing. You maybe feel disconnected, like Lindsey's speaking a foreign language to me right now, and that is absolutely okay. This can feel very esoteric and odd, right? For those of you, and so I want to invite you, if that's the case you're in, to not feel frustrated, to not feel judgment, but just to go, I'm going to sit with this a little bit longer. Potentially after our call ends, our meeting ends today, come back to this, right? Because it's an exploration. And remember how I started our conversation today. It's about you enriching and reconnecting parts of your body and your mind that perhaps you haven't had before, or it's been a while. That takes time and that takes patience. So please hold that for yourself. But now I'm just going to talk about what is happening with a little bit more detail so that you can connect this in a little bit less of an esoteric way. So if you'd like, keep your hands where they are. If you'd like, in addition, keep one hand on the side of the body and take the other hand. And I'd love for you to sit on your hand, literally the bicycle seat muscles, which is where the pelvic floor muscles are. I want you just like to sit on your hand. Okay. This will give you a chance to check in a little bit more with this beautiful coffee press relationship between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. Okay, so just be an observer of your body, be curious, and check in with what you're feeling. What should happen on the inhale is that the belly expands, but also the side and the back. The sits bones, which are literally the bones that you are sitting on if you're in a good posture. Now, if you're back in more of like a TV type posture, you're on your tailbone, and I invite you to sit up and sit on those beautiful bones that are literally meant for ideal stacking of posture. So those actually move away from one another, right? They actually soften on the inhale. This is due to that French press of that pressure system of the diaphragm. Guess what else happens? The tailbone lengthens. It opens away from the body. Now, this is minuscule movements, right? But it is what happens. And then that pelvic floor yields, it softens, it relaxes, and it lets go. And this is a good thing. This is movement at its finest. Now, with the exhale, the exact opposite thing happens. So if your hands are still there, please feel free to keep them there if it's comfortable. And now pay attention to a little bit of what the exhale is doing. So now the waistline where your hand is is coming back together. The sits bones return, the tailbone comes back into place, and the pelvic floor just kind of comes back up. This happens with every breath. Now, that doesn't come up to this tight Kegel place. It comes up to a place of let's say, neutral, right? So if this is a Kegel, and we're going to define what a Kegel is. So if you're not sure about that yet, don't worry, we'll catch you up. But a Kegel would be like flexing of a muscle. This is more of like returning to neutral on the exhale, and then the inhale would be full extension of my arm, so it's kind of nice to relate this part of the body to a part of the body we see on a more regular basis. So you can kind of think about it like that. Perfect. Yeah. And Juju says she feels in her anus. That's absolutely fine, right? Because remember I said the muscles go from pubic bone to tailbone and sits bone to sits bone. So the anus absolutely comprises all of those 14 to 16 muscles. So feeling it in your anus is absolutely fine. All right. So taking a look here more closely, this is not something we're going to geek out on at all today, but I just love to show some appreciation of all the muscles that are here. So on the left-hand side where you see my cursor moving, it's like we're looking into the bowl of the pelvis. So we're standing above someone and we're looking down into the muscles. And you can see that the piriformis is here, which may be a term you're familiar with. It's a hip flexor muscle that connects to, it's a hip rotator muscle that a lot of people have tightness within that might be as a source of sciatic pain. That's part of our pelvic floor, right? Goes all the way up from pubic bone to tailbone and then sits bone to sits bone. And then this other view to the right is if we're below someone looking up at the muscles. So here we see piriformis. This hole right here is the vaginal entrance, and then this one is the rectal entrance. So again, we're not going to spend too much time here, but just wanted to show you visually the muscles that we've been talking about, and one of the 4 muscles that can really feel quite abstract to some of us. Okay. Let's bring it into function. Let's bring this into everyday life, right? So what do we need our pelvic floor for? What do we do on a daily basis that we rely on these muscles? And by the way, this slide says pelvic floor. It could very easily say core, right? Because we talked about those 4 aspects of the system. And those 4 aspects do not work in isolation. They work in tandem. They work as a unit. And so I want you to think about it that way. So the first job is elimination, right? So this is getting urine and bowel movement out when it's the most convenient and optimal time to go, but it's also keeping it in when it's not the most optimal time to go. Okay. Organ protection and support. We talked about this a little bit already about the basket of muscles, keeping the organs in place and supporting everything up to the top of our head. And then lastly would be our ability to participate in intimacy, right? To be comfortable, to achieve orgasm, and for that to be not at all a painful experience for us. So those are the jobs of the pelvic floor. right? And as you can probably tell, most of these jobs happen behind closed doors, right? These are not topics that are dinner talk conversation at all. These are not things we talk about very often, even with our closest of friends. Very taboo. It's very hush hush. And so when we have a client or we ourselves have an experience with this, it feels so empowering to know that there's something we can do about it and that the tools are indeed within us to help us solve these issues that are absolutely part of our quality of life and that are part of our own identity. Okay. Now, I briefly mentioned to you that we could contract our muscles, which would be a kegel, right? We could let go of those muscles, which would be more of like a restful middle place. And we can relax those muscles, which is more of like a relaxation. Well, the really interesting thing about the pelvic floor is that regardless of our symptoms, so what are some of the most common symptoms? I'd love if somebody in the chat could just kind of like type in some ones that they may have or their client has had or they've heard about. Like, what are some of the most common pelvic floor issues? So we have rectal prolapse. What else? Incontinence, absolutely. Vaginismus, which is painful intimacy. Yep. Pain in general. Pelvic organ prolapse, awesome. Prolapses, absolutely, absolutely. Cystoceles, which is a type of prolapse, yep. Constipation, discomfort with diva cups or tampons, pain in sex, hemorrhoids, diastasis. Yep, so now we can see why diastasis would have a connection to the pelvic floor. It's part of that core system, right? So these things really go hand in hand. When we start to spot treat, it becomes very reductionistic and we just see it as one thing and not the system and the body that it's in. Back pain, UTIs. Yes, hernias do have a connection, Juju, because it has so much to do with breathing. So the abdomen is a pressure system. And when we don't allow that pressure system to expand and contract the way that it would, right? When we do that coffee press breathing, what happens is the pressure builds up and it can form a diastasis, which is that abdominal separation. It can lead to hernias. It can lead to prolapse. So it's really all about management of pressure. And it comes back to breathing, right? I mentioned that. I mentioned that breathing is the foundation of this system. And all of these conditions that you guys have heard of, have experienced, have had clients experience, it all comes back to that. Now, here's the thing. Let's just take incontinence, for example. So that's involuntary loss of urine, right? I'm walking to the bathroom and I pee, or I jump off a curb, or I do an exercise, jump rope, and I leak urine when I'm not ready to, right? That's incontinence. And what happens with that is that symptom alone does not tell me, is the pelvic floor too contracted or is it too relaxed? Symptoms tell us nothing. Symptoms just tell us that the pelvic floor and the core needs our attention, right? It needs our attention so that things need to shift a little bit. Usually it means the pelvic floor and the core aren't coordinated. Could come back to breathing, right? Maybe we're holding breath. Maybe we're squeezing our belly in so often throughout the day that we're not allowing that diaphragm to descend in the body and allow that pelvic floor to respond, which brings nourishment to all those muscles, right? So coordination is what it's all about. And so what I want to bring to your guys' attention is that it may not just be the job of tightening and kegels. This very often, in fact, is a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding that we just need to tighten things up so that things can be more coordinated. Because let me ask you this. If I'm here, if I'm already too tight, and by the way, tightness has nothing to do with strength, right? Tone has nothing to do with strength, right? It's in fact a weakness if I'm stuck here, if I'm too tight, because I can't actually relax. I can't actually go through that full range of motion that is absolutely paramount to every single one of these 3 jobs that you see on the slide in front of you, right? We just don't know. We know that These, in order to, let's use elimination, for example. To pee, to have a bowel movement, the muscles have to relax. They have to let go. They have to yield for everything to come out. If I'm here, is that going to be possible? If my muscles are in this tight, restricted place, number one, I'm not going to be able to completely urinate. And number two, more kegels isn't going to do a darn thing for me. It's not going to improve my coordination. It's not going to improve my strength. In fact, I could just get tighter and tighter and more restricted. So what does that mean? Well, we could think of it as overactive versus underactive muscles. Okay. So overactive is when muscles don't relax, when relaxation is important, right? They might even contract when they're supposed to relax. That's vaginismus. One of our attendees mentioned that. The muscles contract, they restrict when they're supposed to be letting go, right? Whereas underactive muscles are muscles that aren't firing or contracting enough to do their job, right? So you're kind of hanging out here versus hanging out here. Either way, we're going to see a symptom in one of the three main jobs of the pelvic floor. Okay. Now, someone asked, what is spot treatment? So spot treatment in the case of the pelvic floor would be something like, do your kegels. The advice that someone might say, just do your kegels, just focus on the pelvic floor. I don't know if you're overactive. I don't know if you're underactive. It's just about those muscles between the pubic bone and the tailbone and the sits bone and sits bone. And we're much bigger beings than that, right? If the pelvic floor's job is to support everything up to the top of our head, I'm not too sure what just squeezing muscles down there is going to accomplish in the grand scheme of things. We're much more holistic than that. So taking it from that approach is super important. Yeah, everyone says do your kegels, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Or, Carmen, what I might say is it may not even be appropriate at all, right? It may not even be something that can help that client because of that coordination issue that we talked about, right? If I'm already stuck here, doing a bunch of this isn't going to help me at all, right? So I just want to bring up this possibility that kegels are not the end all be all, and that thinking about it from this like very reductionistic viewpoint of let's just tackle the pelvic floor is really missing the mark. So if we find out we're underactive, typically it would be great to go to more of a strengthening program. To me, it would potentially include kegels, but it would also include more like body alignment and dynamics and how we're doing everyday activities. So for instance, we work at the Functional Pelvis with a lot of pre and postnatal people. So if we have a client who, we look at 3 months postpartum, they are feeding baby, they're unloading dishes, they're picking stuff off the floor. Like we look at the tasks that they're doing over and over and over again, and we find ways to incorporate a more coordinated approach to accomplishing those activities. Heck of a lot more interesting than just kegels. Now it's getting them to be mindful and present in everyday activities, and it's going to get to the source of the problem so much faster than just that reductionistic Kegel approach. Overactivity would require more of a stretching program. So we would want to release those muscles before we would start to strengthen them so that they could come back down to here so that then we could strengthen them. So I promised you we would define a Kegel, and let's do it. So it's a closure and a lifting of the pelvic floor muscles, and it includes some key aspects. So believe it or not, the clitoris actually nods in a Kegel. It actually kind of almost like if you had an envelope and you moistened the edge of the envelope, folded it forward and pasted it down, right? Like it literally should do that. We should see the anus winking. The vaginal canal will close like a door and then lift like an elevator. What you should not feel, and this is just as important as what you should feel, right? I think if we approach what we're not feeling from like a curiosity place and not a place of judgment, it's so helpful, right? So we shouldn't feel a pushing out sensation. We shouldn't feel like our belly is bulging forward, right? Remember we talked about those low abs, those transverse abdominis being part of the system. And if it's pushing out, right? At a time when things should be lifting and closing. It's not ideal, right? We should feel it kind of lifting back into the spine. And we shouldn't see a whole lot of ancillary movement, right? We shouldn't see the chest or the inner thighs or the outer thighs moving too much, right? And in an ideal isolated Kegel, it'd be just that part of the body. Some special checks that we can do are where we could place our finger right here at the perineum, right? The place between the vagina opening and the rectum. And we could just literally put our finger there, not going inside at all, and moving up and down and left and right. This area is so important because so many muscles and nerves originate here. So if we have a sense for how this part of the body is moving, we really have some insight for how the pelvic floor in general is working and moving for us. Okay. So this basically just adds on to it saying, when you do this, do you feel any restriction or any tugging? Does one area not want to move as easily as the other? And if you're comfortable, I invite you to try this after our talk today or at some point over the next couple of days, just starting to check in, right? So we started with that breathing exercise. That's foundational and fundamental. We can take it a step further by now bringing in this part of the body, like really checking in with those 14 to 16 muscles down there and how they're moving based on their musculature. Briefly want to touch on pelvic pain, especially because I saw a few people in the chat mention that, right? So pelvic pain is never something we want to see. Anything with intimacy, with everyday activities, there's a big nervous system component. And we're going to get into that in just a moment, how the nervous system really plays a huge role in this. And it often is a sign and symbol of the body needing to get in touch with itself again, right? Being kind of like a reset button. And so if our clients or you listening to this talk today have any pain, have any of these symptoms, I encourage you to know that there's something we can do about it, and that so many more tools than you think you do to really start to understand and unravel some of these issues. Just starting with the simple fact that, number one, breath is the foundation. Breath is so important for this system, both for people that need strengthening and relaxation. And that the answer isn't just Kegels, right? Those two alone are things that most people just don't know, right? It's not in Cosmo. It's not written in our mainstream media. So that alone is a really amazing starting point. Okay, I want to turn the conversation now to something that's very, very important. And this gets into the nervous system a little bit. And I feel like is also really important for us to address as birth care professionals, because when we work with pre and postnatal people, we often hear and can absorb their trauma, right? And this is a part of the body that is really sensitive to trauma. And it doesn't have to be trauma directly to this part of the body. It certainly can be, but it can also just be from stress. So when we try to hold it all together or feel in control, just hearing those words, do you notice anything in your body? If you do, I'll be watching the chat. I'd love to hear what you guys notice when I even say those words, keeping it together and being in control, right? Contraction. Yep, you stop breathing a little bit, tension and discomfort, breath changes, pressure, tensing up, core contracting, butterflies in the belly, restriction. These are flying in faster than I can read them. Exactly. All of those things. Tight, not responsive, right? Being here, being in this tight Kegel, belly sucked in, right? Like holding, right? So feeling safe, freezing, exactly, right? And so a lot of times the pelvic floor is simply reacting to the issue. It is not the driver, right? It's not the source of the problem. It's responding to trauma in the nervous system. And so what's really important is to know that, right? That's another reason why spot treating won't exactly cut it. And it's important to know that we might be doing that ourselves when we're holding space for a client, when we're witnessing something that a client is going through, right? So I love the answers that came in. I'll ask you to pay attention to if this ever happens for you, check in with your body next time you're present with your client. What happens to you? Do you try to keep it together for them? Do you button up and squeeze in, right? So we're going to talk about ADLs now. Juju, thank you. So you can define trauma, and this is not my definition, which is why I put it in quotes. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. Barbara, you know the definition. I love that. Yeah, exactly. So one of the themes of our talk is about being presilient versus being resilient. So I love resiliency, hugely important. But if we as birth care workers can be presilient, meaning we can be on top of our own resiliency by noticing these things, by going, okay, wait a second, like this tense situation is building and I'm feeling my body having this response. I'm still going to be present. I'm still going to help this client, but like, what am I doing? And I'm anticipating because I felt it before, right? I call this presiliency because it is part of our arsenal of tools that we can help ourselves to be more resilient, right? And so what are some ways we can do that? Well, absolutely tracking and getting to know your own system through simple ADLs. So as Barbara said, ADLs are activities of daily living. It's a term we use as occupational therapists quite a bit. It means things we do every single day to take care of ourselves. Could be brushing teeth, could be unloading the dishwasher, could be doing our hair, it could be feeding, could be dressing, right? Knowing our own system through these activities really culminate into sort of knowing what our body may need. So for instance, when I was going through graduate school, which was a very stressful time for me, I noticed that anytime I really wasn't sure of material, I would do this to my forehead, right? So I would like constantly try to like iron out probably my very furrowed brow. This was a self-soothing gesture for me. And it helped me kind of cope and even like brought my attention to my brain, stimulated like my focus, right? And it was a gesture that helped to soothe me. So kind of getting to know your own tools that kind of help you get through everyday life is a beautiful way to start. And that just starts with paying attention, which is incredibly important, right? It's not always fancy yoga movements or the best breathing technique or whatever you can search out. Remember me search versus research, right? It's not about that newest research that's out there. It's about what do you need? What's your me search, right? Like what works for you? And often we know already, and it may take a few moments to stop and analyze or pay attention to yourself over the next couple of days. But you know inside yourself, like some rocking, some tapping, right? Maybe some like gentle, deep pressure, right? Like these are things that we can carry with us and take everywhere. And they're often very ritualistic, subtle layers of simply knowing what you need, right? And I love this question. And this is something we can think about in terms of ourselves and our clients. And it's not about a trauma response is not about what's wrong with you, but what are you adapting to? What's going on in your environment that your brilliant physiology is adapting to? It's an adaptation response. It's like leaking because our body is saying, hey, I'm not coordinated, right? Like I need your attention. I want us to look at this in this holistic way. And I want us to really start to understand there's another approach that can be had. It's very convenient to think of resources outside of us, but it's often right there within us. I really believe that little things add up. So we're not looking for the solution to the problem. We're looking more for how things are connected to each other, right? And I also love thinking about it from a social justice standpoint, because these are things that we all have access to. We all can stop and pay attention and improve our own sense of what brings us comfort, what are triggers for us. Like we can really create the conditions that we need for change to occur. And more often than not, clients and we just need some space for soothing and resiliency and nervous system nourishment in order for pelvic floor symptoms to have a change of trajectory. If you are interested in what I'm talking about, a lot of the theories that I presented to you so far come from Lisa Elliott, which she has a beautiful paper called The Threshold Theory of Change. So check that out if that is something that interests you. We are getting close to our Q&A time. And so what I want to just bring your attention to here is that this is a pelvic check-in that I created that you can use for yourself or you can use for your clients, but it was in response to people saying like, how do I know something's going on? And so it's categorized here by bladder and bowel, sexuality, pain and prolapse, all the things that we talked about. And if things are going on, like for instance, bullet number 3 under bladder, going pee more often than every 2 to 3 hours, right? Like you notice that's something that's happening, might be something to then check out the other sections and go, is there something happening in my pelvic floor that I might want to pay a little more attention to? I think this is important because so many of us kind of take for granted our everyday habits and routines to the point where we just think, no, every time before I leave the house, I pee. It's just my normal. Doesn't everyone do that? And because we have these activities that happen behind closed doors, we never stop in and check about what's optimal for our health. So something like this can help us kind of come back to that middle place. This is free. It's available on my website. You're more than welcome to have it, as is this one. This one goes into a little bit more detail. I also have on my website a 16-page guide called Caring for Your Core, Back, and Pelvic Floor. This is something that's fantastic for you to freely share with your clients, as well as massaging C-section and perineum scars are a very big passion of mine, and I think, quite frankly, aren't talked about enough. So I also have some great free resources, both on YouTube as well as like handouts that you can print or send to your clients to kind of have them start to begin this healing journey that, quite frankly, just isn't talked about enough. And notice it's all about putting the tools in their own hands. These are things they can absolutely do themselves. They don't need a professional. They don't need a pelvic floor therapist. And in fact, like them figuring this out on their own and doing their own massage, they're going to expedite that healing so much faster. I also talk about lubes and the importance of the different categories of lubes and why you would use some more than others, the ingredients to unavoid. So I'm kind of giving you like a rundown of like my most passionate educational topics, all stuff that's available on my website. Emma's asking my website. It's here on my last slide where I remind you of how grateful I am for each of you being here. It's functionalpelvis.com. A lot of those free resources are like the C-section massage and the Caring for Your Back and Core are either available right when you go to my website, or if you click on my blogs, my blog articles will go into depth on a lot of these topics where you'll find references to these really free available resources. And then for $39, I created this online course that gets people to understand that they can do this all on their own, right? They can perform their own self-exam and they can think about kegels right here as functional activities in everyday life, how we can move from sit to stand, how we can lift, how we can carry. So it's starting to take the conversation away from kegels and from professionals that can fix us to recognizing that the tools are there in our own hands to take care and understand and deepen this conversation and connection with our own body. All right. Excellent. I would love to open up the floor now to any questions that you guys have. So feel free to ask any question you guys have in the Q&A chat. I'm not sure if in webinar chat you can unmute yourself and I can hear your voice, but you're always welcome to do that if that's something you're comfortable with as well.
Okay, here we go. Questions are coming in. You mentioned sciatic nerve pain as a portion of the pelvic floor work, but can you say more about this?
Sure. So I'm just going to briefly go back to the anatomy picture. It's kind of nice to see the interrelatedness here. So piriformis is a muscle that really connects to the sciatic area in the lumbar system. And so when that piriformis is putting pressure on the nerve, we can start to have that sciatic pain. And as you can see, the piriformis, while it's not a true pelvic floor muscle, it's in that basket, it's right there. And so when we kind of restore nourishment to all of those muscles and all of those nerves, we can really start to see, and the ligaments have a big role in sciatic pain as well. We can really start to see that shift because of the interrelatedness and connectedness of the piriformis to all of the other pelvic floor muscles.
How soon can massage happen after a C-section?
Yeah, after a C-birth, you know, it's you really need to wait for the massage to heal. Excuse me, for the scar to heal, right? We don't want to introduce any bacteria into it. Same thing with the perineum. So we just want to make sure, and I say it in that YouTube video that I referenced. You just want to make sure that it's closed and healed before you start the massage. And it's never too late. I have a lot of people saying, like, it's been 10 years, it's been 15 years. It is never too late to start this work.
Does your online classes targeted towards birth workers or just clients?
It's a great question. So I have a couple online classes. The one that I talked about today was called Kegels That Work, which is literally www.kegelsthatwork.com. That is meant for the client. That is meant for people to literally take their own pelvic floor journey into their own hands. I have a lot of professionals that have taken it to either understand it themselves or to help articulate these concepts to their clients. That's great. But I also do continuing education for people who are interested in pelvic health. So I have a course where I dive into all aspects of pelvic floor health. I only open it twice a year, and I actually just closed it. And then a third course I have is called In Their Hands, which teaches people how to conduct pelvic floor exams through virtual care, right? So with COVID, we've had to get really creative. We can't do internal exams with our clients. So again, teaching them in their own hands how to do an even more thorough evaluation of their pelvic floor. It goes beyond Kegels That Work. Kegels That Work is really approachable for most people, but In Their Hands just goes into it a little bit more depth, gives you a few more options for assessing your pelvic floor. So short and long answer is that it's really for everybody.
Do you have any info on the correlation between labia adhesions and maxi pad chemicals?
Such a good question, Lindsay. I do not have any research on that, but it is something I have thought a lot about. Because here's the thing, when we wear pads, it contains chemicals, just like diapers, that basically wick moisture away from the genitals, right? And when moisture is wicked away, we no longer have the surfactant quality that moisture provides for us, right? So labia adhesions are basically where, you know, like the labia is basically stuck together, right? Like it doesn't have that mobility to it. And so pads, which whisk away moisture, can only serve to further exacerbate the discomfort, the lack of movement, right? And again, like we talked so much about how fluidity and movement is so important. So I personally recommend clients use more other products, you know, like the underwear that's out now, like Speaks and Thinks, and some of the other underwear that's out there that don't have those whisking chemicals that can really change our vulvar health.
Are there any common things that pregnant people can do in general to protect their pelvic floor in pregnancy?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is a really important question. So I think the number one thing is to get in touch and understand your inner core in a way that you probably never stopped to ask before. So it's really interesting. I've done a lot of workshops throughout my career, and I always start them off by saying, like, how do you define a healthy pelvic floor? It's okay to say you don't know, that's why we're here, but just give me one attribute. Tell me an attribute of a healthy pelvic floor. And I remember one time someone said, one that I don't have to think about, a pelvic floor that I don't have to think about. And I remember simultaneously being like, I get that, but I'm also really sad about that answer, right? Because we aren't thinking about it until there's a problem. And so in pregnancy, if we can stop and think about this connection between breath and pelvic floor and just kind of understand that system, that it's not actually the vagina that pushes out a baby, but it's the uterus, right? And the vagina actually has to, and the pelvic floor actually has to get out of the way. Even just starting to understand that and the breath mechanics, to me, the diaphragm is really the king of the core. And so starting to understand the role of the breath and how it changes the pressure mechanics for not only labor and delivery, but for support, right? Like being able to maybe lift a toddler while you're pregnant or something, right? Like all of these things are about understanding the cues and the system and how the system is working for you. So I think in general, like connecting and understanding the breath and whatever that means for you, that could be meditation, that could be yoga, right? But just taking time to pause and feel that connection, I think is really important. Spending some time understanding push mechanics, right? So many of us learn this new skill of pushing a baby out in real time. I did something called birthing rehearsals with our clients where we stopped and took time and took stock of what part of the body is the optimal part of the body to use. I think is really important. So thinking about preparing the body in a way that is the most supportive for the longevity, not just the experience of delivering, but our life going all the way to perimenopause and menopause, I think could really serve us as a culture. And I'd love to see that things are starting to move in that direction.
Can you speak on how learning your own pelvis can help with orgasms?
Yes, I love that question. So remember we said the three main jobs of the pelvic floor are elimination, intimacy, and organ protection support. So orgasms are absolutely fundamentally part of the pelvic floor's job. And at the end of the day, it comes down to coordination. So a robust sensation for orgasm is one that moves fully through space. So can contract, can relax, and can let go. You're going to get the most robust sensation that you can from an orgasm from a muscle that can move fully through space, not one that's stuck in an over tight position and not one that's stuck in a more relaxed state. So understanding your own pelvis, and I actually love the way this question was answered because it wasn't just understanding your pelvic floor, it's understanding your pelvis, it's understanding your inner core system that can help you understand that dynamic of being able to achieve a better orgasm and thinking about it from a muscular standpoint. But guess what else? Thinking about it from the art of arousal, right? Like thinking about it from all of these other things that aren't just like achieving orgasm, right? Not just like being able to think about doing kegels to enhance that process, but really understanding the body, the art of arousal, what excites you, how do you build sensation back in after you've had a family and are very tired and have all the role transitions. Like stopping and thinking about all of those things can absolutely incredibly enhance orgasm.
What would be the top 3 things you think everyone should do and change?
For the pelvic floor, I'm guessing, like everything. I'm just trying to think of another, like more specific what they might mean. I mean, I'll spitfire here. If I'm not answering your question, let me know and maybe just ask it a slightly different way. But I would say number one is that we know and understand that any sort of pelvic floor issue, whether it's bowel or bladder or prolapse, intimacy issues, are not something that we should ignore. We have absolute ability to take control and to understand and to be our own detective into figuring out these things, right? And that to not think of it, number two would be to not think of it from a reductionist standpoint, to think about it in this holistic activities of daily living, which is so much more interesting than just sitting down and doing a bunch of kegels, right? Like, and who even, like, who enjoys that and what does it solve? Mm-hmm. And then number three would be that, like, something as simple as looking at that checklist and kind of like asking yourself, okay, yeah, I didn't realize that I wasn't supposed to push my urine out. Like, I didn't know I could just sit down on the toilet and allow urine to come out, and that I could be actually changing my physical strength and my body mechanics by doing that. Or knowing optimal urination is 6 to 8 times in a 24-hour period. A lot of my clients will be like, I go every 15 minutes. I can't sit through a movie, right? So I think just kind of knowing what's optimal and then asking yourself, is there something with curiosity that you can do better? No judgment, no like shame, but just, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to push out urine, right? So I think those are 3 things that I would change, but please let me know if you meant something else.
If someone does tear during birth, are providers repairing them in a way to promote optimal healing? Any way we can advocate for our clients in that scenario?
Hopefully they're repairing them in a way that's optimal to healing, but that goes down so much to the individual practitioner, right? Like so much of that has to do with the skill and their approach. And so to advocate for your client, which I know all of you do so beautifully, would be to, I think the thing that I encourage most of my clients to ask when they're speaking to their practitioners is if they do an episiotomy, do they do it straight down or do they do it to the side? Meaning, do they cut from vaginal opening to rectal opening, or do they do it more medially to the side? Medial is more optimal if they have to do an episiotomy. So that's a question I usually encourage my clients to ask, just so they know if they're on the same page, right? Communication is king, and understanding your practitioner's approach is a great way to support our clients because they're engaging in that dialogue, right? Like they're having those conversations. I would also say that other ways you can support your clients would be to let them know that they should do massage, right? Like a lot of practitioners, especially with C-sections, aren't sharing that, like any other body part. We had a knee replacement, we had a shoulder replacement. One of the top things we do, we send them to therapy to get massaging done. Why aren't we talking about this when it comes to the abdomen or the pelvic floor is beyond me. So also giving them resources, how and when they can start that on their own, to really encourage a part of the body that needs mobility, it needs movement, it needs range of motion. And when a scar is there, it can lead to adhesions, which are basically stuck tissue, right? So I would say those are some ways that you can really advocate for your clients.
There's definitely some patriarchy, misogyny in there. Yeah, I've heard clients who were going back to get their second C-section and their organs were fused together with that scar.
Yeah, and you guys have heard about like the husband stitch.
Mm-hmm.
They make the perineum, the opening tighter so the husband can have more pleasure. Like in the end of the day, that's serving no one, because they're not. Yeah, okay, that's a whole other conversation.
Not even, yeah. 3 more questions. Any suggestions on regular everyday posture changes or resting positions that can help improve pelvic health? I like this question because your videos and your newsletter have been very helpful.
Yeah. So I do have a weekly newsletter called the Hump Day Hustle, where this is like, it's free, and I go into this kind of stuff all the time because it's really my passion. I love talking about how daily habits can optimize our pelvic floor health. And I would say, honestly, like the top one that comes to mind is thinking about how the top of our spine connects with the bottom. And a really simple way, if you guys can just give me like 15 seconds to walk you through. If you put your hands on your jaw, if you just open and close your mouth and move your hands around until you feel a hinge, right? So I don't feel it down there. Oh, there it is. Right, keep your hand there. Now notice, where is your hands in relationship to your neck? So I'm going to turn to the side so you can see me. I'm really jutted forward. Do you see that? How forward my head is compared to my hands? Guess what? This is literally the top of my spine. Everyone thinks it's somewhere here in their neck, but it's literally here. So open and close a little bit. And then I want you to think about, how can you make your neck longer so that now this top of your spine is more over your shoulders? I think with the virtual world we're living in and have been for a while now, we get so that text neck, right? And guess what? When we get into that text neck, our spine gets into a C shape, right? So we're literally sitting now with my tail tucked, my head forward. I look like a turtle. And that is changing my pelvic floor musculature because I'm not sitting on the bones that I'm meant to sit on to support. And my muscles have to change their length to now accommodate this out of the ordinary posture. So I would say an easy thing you can do is to just think about where your head is in relationship to your shoulders or your heart. Then think about where is it in relationship to your belly. It should be right over it. And that would be this optimal stacking position, which, believe it or not, has a huge impact on pelvic floor resiliency.
Thank you. Can you talk about menopause and pelvic floor?
So that's a huge topic. We could have a whole hour on this. I love this topic. It is really important because I think that when I first started this work, I was really drawn to helping older adults. So anyone that was over 60 who had any of these issues. And then when I started my own family, I realized we could go back in time and maybe address some of these issues potentially when they were happening or when we were first curious about them, which tends to be when we start our family. Could we make a change? Because the number one reason we're admitted to nursing homes is because of incontinence, okay? Because of our inability to control urine and bowel movement. And so if we could change that dynamic, like what a ripple effect could we have, right? So I would say that so much about understanding the role of hormones is incredibly important. Sleep cycles, right? Sleep hygiene. Understanding that lubrication is so important. So I briefly went over in my slides, like the thing about lubrication. It's a topic I'm really passionate about, using the right type of lube. And so educating the importance of daily moisture for a menopausal person, as well as intimacy, is really, really important. And then topics of prolapse usually come up around that part of someone's life too. So how can we support those organs better?
And last question, you've answered 13 questions.
I wish I could spend more time on them, but unfortunately we're down to the rapid fire.
Can you speak on how learning one pelvis can help with infertility?
Yes. So again, this could be a whole nother conversation. So there's a lot of reasons why infertility could happen. Number one, it could be, a sense of like a freeze response of the nervous system, right? Like not being ready, not being there. So I think that understanding your pelvis and your pelvic floor can really help with understanding that psychological mind-body link, right? So pelvic floor is never just body. It's never just physical. So I think if we can really approach it from that way, it's incredibly advantageous to be able to do that. And then I would say that there's also an alignment issue, right, with fertility. So sometimes it has to do with positions of, let's say, the uterus, other ligaments, right? So also understanding and being able to understand your own body and its inner workings could be incredibly important to understanding fertility. But it should be like a village response, right? It should really be like a team of people that can really help you, because fertility is rarely just one, right? One issue.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsey. I wish we could answer questions all day. Where can folks contact you if they come up with more or want to follow up?
So things like, Kathy's asking about a lube that's pH balanced. I have recommendations on my website. So if you go to functionalpelvis.com, you will see a link to all this stuff that I mentioned. If you don't see the link to the lubes, let me know, because oh, you know what? It's I'm just going to type it in if you don't mind. I think it's Functional Pelvis, and I'm happy to share the slides too if anyone would like them. And then I believe it's Lindsey's recommendations. So it's Lindsey's recommendations. I probably spelled recommendations wrong, but just go to that and you will see that. And Kathy or anyone else will figure out a way to get you guys the slides.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Enjoy your day, everyone, and we'll see you for the next webinar coming up.
Everyone with a pelvis. I couldn't agree more, Olivia. Thank you so much, guys. This has been such a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to each one of you. And thank you so much for everything you guys do for our clients. And take care of yourselves too.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.